Hi, good afternoon. I'm glad you all made it over here. This is the only session of the course that's here in Wilson Hall. So starting next week, we'll be back at Building 50. Last week, I received about a half a dozen emails from various people with suggestions of future topics, speakers, a couple of very good, helpful criticisms. So I welcome all of you to please do that because it's very helpful to us. So I want to recommend a book. Many of you may have read it. It's called The Omnivore's Dilemma by Poland. And it's really somewhat apropos to the topic of today's thing. And so I'll put it on the website, actually, so the reference, if you don't jot it down now. Okay, so obviously today we're discussing one of the great problems which seems to be increasing, of enormous severity, raises incredible questions. One of them is, where is my, one of them is, can you put on that? Yeah, thank you. Is this an American disease or is this a global disease? We take a lot of hits in the cartoons around the world and with things like this. Is this a global problem, or is this something that's kind of restricted to countries that have more food than they know what to do with, and perhaps more poverty than they know how to deal with? So this is a partial list of the risk factors of obesity. And so there's this great concern we'll hear a lot about, is whether the epidemic in childhood obesity is going to be translated in later life into this incredible array of predominantly metabolic type disorders, including more and more information about obesity as a risk factor in certain cancers, infection, and even some disorders that we think of as being primarily in the central nervous system. But of course, the big things that one hears most about are the epidemics of type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, cirrhosis, and hypertension, arteriosclerosis, stroke, myocardial infarction, et cetera, et cetera. And so thinking of my own personal battle with borderline obesity, I sort of cooked this up this morning because it's kind of an eternal battle. And it's a battle between will and other things. So the will part of it is best expressed by the epic poem Invictus by Henley, the last line of which is, "I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul." Now, is that true when it comes to obesity? Does anybody actually conquer the problem by sheer willpower? Hopefully our speakers today will help, because some of us need that help. On the other hand, is this something else? Is this predominantly a genetic basis on which other things, environment, economics, and everything are superimposed? Or maybe it's all of them. If the big battle is calorie counting, what goes in and what goes out, I just arbitrarily, almost off the top of my head, listed the things that pop in my mind that represent the warriors in the battle. There's the food supply industry, which survives by generating more food and kind of food that will appeal to people to eat, processed food, heavy advertising of that kind of food, snacks and so forth. And this, of course, is a huge commercial venture. Somebody makes money when we drink those big bottles of, should I say, Coca-Cola, or for that matter, any sugar cola. And what about the diets? Is there such a thing as a diet that actually works? Or is there some common denominator more related to Henley up above than to the actual composition? So the other thing I thought about, they used to talk about good calories and bad calories. Well, that's sort of ancient stuff, but in terms of actual food, are there foods where one can think of in terms of they're sort of good for you from a caloric standpoint, and others that are really pretty bad? Usually the bad ones taste the best. And then there's the other side of the equation. Calories have to be burned up. Well, can you really burn them up by exercise? Does it work? And how long does it work for? And how much should you run? Or maybe you shouldn't run at all. Maybe you should just quietly lift weights that you can. And what about medicine? Is the pharmaceutical industry going to generate something that's going to permit everybody to eat whatever they want to eat, and yet at the same time, by some magic, control the fact that it's not turned into calories? Is there a future for it? Well, this is sort of the battleground, I guess, and we're going to hear about many more things. But the big point of today's talk is that this, once again, is a bridging of science and medicine. And the science of obesity is something that has rapidly expanded and continues to in our understanding of things that answer some of these questions, such as why is it so difficult to actually lose weight? And this gets tied into metabolism, hormonal regulation of appetite, satiety, what's going on in our heads. And all of this is played out against this enormous scene of tremendous public health concern. And it's terrifying to think that if some of the predictions that are being made actually turn out to be true, we're going to have a nation that is overwhelmed with all of these serious medical diseases, let alone the psychological ones. So, NIH is in a great position to provide, maybe not all the answers, but to stimulate our thoughts and tell us where we are. And they realize the reason why they're in such a great position is because there are investigators here who really are at the forefront of approaching these studies. And we're fortunate to have two of them as part of this program. So the first speaker is going to be Jack Yanovski, who graduated in medicine from the University of Pennsylvania and then received a PhD in physiological psychology. He then trained in pediatrics, came to the NIH where he became chief of pediatrics at the clinical center, and then several years ago was appointed as the head of the unit on growth and obesity in NICHD's Department of Endocrinology branch, where he serves as the head. We posted several of his articles, and I would urge you to read them. I realize it was a little late in getting them on the website this week. That was my fault. But I would urge you to read them, or at least skim through them, because they represent the highest level of clinical investigation directly concerned with these questions I've been enumerating. And our second speaker is Kevin Hall, who got a PhD in biophysics at McGill. And he has developed a mathematical model which links metabolism with obesity. And this has attracted enormous interest. He sent several articles, which are also on the website. And his studies are in humans and rodents. And his goal is to develop predictive models to answer questions like, how much weight are you going to lose if you clip off 10 calories a day, or if you run 3 miles? Very practical questions, but they are reflected in terms of the complexity of metabolic control. So our first speaker is Jack Yanovski. Thank you very much. I think you want to use that.
Okay, thanks very much. Appreciate the introduction. Today we're really going to talk about very basic facts about obesity, some of the consequences that Wynn has already discussed with you, but a fair amount on causes. And then Dr. Hall is going to talk very specifically about energy balance and how weight is gained and lost, and I think in a very wonderful way to help us understand how we really function in the world. So my task is actually quite broad, and I'm not really going to talk about treatment at all, although I'd be happy to talk about it in the questions later on. My objectives today are going to be to discuss what is obesity and the medical consequences of obesity, and then why do some people become obese and others not. And this image of a family where everyone is heavy, even the dog you'll see in the corner there, is one that I think is actually quite reasonable for today, but it's a little deceptive because there are many families in which there are some individuals who do not become heavy. And we really want to understand what are the differences between people that allow some folks to thrive in our current environment and others not to do so well. So obesity, of course, is an excess of body fat. It's from the Latin obesitas, fatness or corpulence. And in clinical practice, we define it using a metric called the body mass index. So that's the weight, in this case in kilograms, divided by the height, measured in meters, and that quantity squared. And for adults, it's a very convenient measure because it seems to reflect adiposity throughout life fairly well until you get into quite older individuals when folks begin to lose muscle mass. So it's a measure of weight adjusted for height. It's highly correlated with body fat, and we'll talk a little bit about how the relationship does vary somewhat with age, with sex, with ethnicity, and body build. It is quite easy to obtain, just need weight and height, and it doesn't distinguish between body fat and muscle, so it is possible to have individuals like this who weigh the same, Arnold Schwarzenegger on the right and Fred Flintstone on the left, both overweight, but only one is over fat. But in general, it's the case is that there is a strong relationship between obesity and percentage of body fat for men and women, but it differs somewhat between men and women in that at any given body mass index, women will tend to have a greater percentage body fat, and so the normal range of body fat is higher among women than among men. Nevertheless, these kind of data give you a sense that as we get towards a body mass over 30, which is what is traditionally considered obesity, the percentage of body fat for both men and women is often over 30%, and often much higher than that in the 40 and 50% of total body weight. So if half of your body mass is fat, that's a problem, and we'll talk about those the problems in a moment. Now, if we use this BMI standard, we classify more than 65% of all U.S. adults as overweight, and that means a body mass index over 25, and over 30% are obese. And these three maps of the U.S. show the trends by a questionnaire method, the BRFSS, starting in 1990 and going through 2010. And as the colors become warmer towards red, the percentage of individuals who are obese increases. And so you can see that there's been a massive increase in the prevalence of obesity since the 80s and 90s. So many more red and orange states, and this has nothing to do with their political backgrounds. All right. And the same is true, unfortunately, for children, where we define it as a BMI greater than the 95th percentile standard defined in the 1970s. So the number of children who have this BMI that's greater than the standard has increased precipitously over the last 40 years. Fortunately, it has begun to stabilize, and this is true in adults as well, but it's begun to stabilize already in girls over the last 10 years. And in boys, it's still increasing to a small extent, but in general, you can see that the rates are now on the order of about 20% of all children are considered obese. Now, there was at one point, a few years ago, a concern that the increases that you can see here were going to continue kind of forever, that this increase was just going to go up until 100% of the people were considered obese. But that's not a reasonable statement of what's going on. What we're seeing is most of the most susceptible people have now, in the US, have now become obese. They may continue to get a little bit heavier over time, but chances are that we've almost crested for this vast increase in the prevalence of obesity. And we're really hopeful that because of either the efforts that have gone on in the US or because of the natural history is that we've reached the point where most folks who are most susceptible have become obese. Whichever is the real reason, we hope that we've come to a point where we can now deal with the problems such as they are without having to deal with great increases over the next few years. Now, in adults, BMI-associated disease risk varies according to the degree of obesity. So we classify folks as being underweight or normal weight or overweight or obese in 3 different classifications. And by the time you have class 3 obesity with a body mass index over 40, folks are considered to have extremely high risk of the complications of obesity. But you'll notice that underweight individuals also have increased risks of disease. And that's for several reasons, but one of them is insufficient body lean mass. And I don't think we're really going to talk too much about that group. But additional risks beyond these classification of just body weight include poor aerobic fitness, so how much exercise you do, as Wynn was discussing earlier. And in fact, some differences in what we call body composition, those with a large waist circumference tend to have more complications of weight. So let's look at that for a moment. There have been a lot of data put together that suggested that some individuals, even who are lean or normal weight, may be metabolically unfit. And it turns out that they have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. This is cardiovascular disease mortality. And if you define the unfit folks who aren't able to exercise well, they have a vastly increased risk compared to the fit folks at any given degree of leanness. And you'll notice that, of course, as the level of body weight goes up, the risk of cardiovascular disease increases even among the fit folks who are obese. But you can see that being unfit, even while lean, is more dangerous for your heart than being obese but fit. So partly this is because the folks have a great deal of lean mass and not as much adipose tissue, but it's also an independent risk of the fitness itself. So naturally we prefer to be right here in this category if we could, but fitness is a clearly important thing that we should all strive for at any degree of adiposity. And the second thing I mentioned was this concept that the waist circumference might matter. We don't really think that it's the fat that's measured that's truly the cause of complications, but it's really a reflector of metabolic disease that leads to adipose tissue being deposited in the visceral compartment, with the so-called intra-abdominal fat. And so that gets measured as an increased waist circumference. That fat is a measure of fat being deposited in many places, including the liver, including muscles, including the heart. So this visceral adipose tissue measurement is a marker for metabolic risk, but in and of itself, we don't think that's truly a cause of complications. And the medical complications of obesity, and particularly visceral obesity, are myriad. They cover every body system. Wynn mentioned some of them. I'll go through a few of the major categories. So cardiovascular disease and stroke is clearly increased. Increased pressure inside the head, so-called intracranial pressure, risk for cataracts, heart disease, diabetes, a huge risk, problems with lipids, high blood pressure, gynecologic abnormalities, including abnormal menstrual cycles and infertility, and this thing called polycystic ovarian syndrome that affects a large proportion of women today. Diseases of the bone like osteoarthritis, which can be limiting in terms of the ability to exercise because of pain, problems with the veins like phlebitis, gout is more common, gallbladder disease, liver disease, lung disease of various sorts, including sleep apnea, which can have effects on the brain as well independently of obesity. And then this risk for cancer, where it looks like breast, uterus, cervix, prostate, kidney, colon, pancreas, many cancers have an increased risk associated with greater body fat. So the rest of the time, now that we've very briefly talked about complications of obesity, I'd like to discuss why do people become obese and how can we classify them to try to understand how we might consider treatment. And sort of at the very basic level, obesity has to be caused by long-term positive energy balance, which means energy intake has to be greater than energy expenditures in order for fat to be stored. Now, energy intake can be greater than energy expenditure when children are growing. And we know that, for instance, pubertal boys are taking in tremendous calories without putting on a lot of body fat. But if sufficient calories are taken in above expenditures, eventually some fat stores will be developed. And we'll hear a lot, I think, about how that happens when Dr. Hall speaks a little bit later. But I think we can possibly consider, even if there aren't any other weapons of mass destruction that we would commonly have in our households, the knife, the fork, and the spoon might be considered America's weapons of mass destruction. But beyond the fact that we know that food intake is going to matter, I think it's very important for us to recognize that there's a serious contribution of genetics to obesity. And probably the clearest examples are from twin studies. And there have been very elegant studies examining the fate of children raised with or without their parents. And they come to the conclusion that more than 50%, and in some studies, even as high as 80%, although I think now the number is probably more towards the 50% number, but somewhere in a large proportion of the variance in human body weight can be accounted really by genetic variation. And then the remainder is explained by common environmental factors. So whether we have a lot of fast food restaurants per square inch, whether we're an affluent society, and other factors that are environmental in nature. And the clearest environmental example that many people use, and I like to use, are genetically related Indian families who live in Mexico and the Pima Indians in the US. They're found to be quite genetically similar, so we know it's not that they've had a drift of their genetics. And the group in the U.S. where the Gila River was diverted, meaning that they could no longer farm successfully and depend upon largely handouts from the U.S. government, and have come to have a great deal of fondness for Spam and other high energy foods. All of them were obese. 3 of them have diabetes already. But the Indian family from Mexico, where they live a hard scrabble farming life, subsistence farming, not a lot of opportunities to watch television. This group, none of them are obese and none of them have diabetes. So we know the environment has an enormous effect on the chance of developing obesity. There's no question whatsoever that the environment is a key factor for what's happened over the last 40 years. So for instance, we can see correlations between portion sizes in restaurants and the prevalence of obesity. Now, it's a bit of a specious comparison because as people get heavier, they're going to eat more. But regardless, we can see that the number of so here's the percentage of overweight, or obesity, this 95th percentile rate, increasing dramatically over 30 years, and then the number of large-sized portions introduced at fast food restaurants increasing roughly in parallel to what's seen in terms of the risks of obesity. Here's some examples. McDonald's fries have increased threefold. Coca-Cola portions, again, about threefold. Snickers used to be 1 ounce, now they're about almost 4 ounces. And the calories that are contained in these portions increase along with them. So calorie availability has certainly increased over the years. And that's, again, a success of advertising, as Wynn was pointing out. Some of you may be aware of this movie, Super Size Me, where a filmmaker decided to eat nothing but fast food for an entire month. And every time he was asked if he wanted to supersize, he had to say yes and then consume it. And at the end of his time, he'd gained a considerable amount and actually had developed some complications of his obesity just from that brief time of overnutrition. So we know that there's a potential role that can be played by the restaurants in our environment or the food environment in general. But we also know that there are environmental changes in physical activity that may contribute to obesity, although it's harder to test those. We know that there's decreased physical activity in the school and workplace, so fewer schools offer daily physical education. Fewer jobs require manual labor, and there's certainly an increasing lack of sidewalks in neighborhoods or safe areas to go outside. And then increased sedentary behaviors also are well associated with obesity. So in the office and the home, people are using more computers, playing video games, and watching television. Here are the kind of data that are shown epidemiologically that the relative risk of developing obesity increases in proportion to how much TV is viewed by adults. So here's 0 to 1 hours a week up to greater than 40 hours a week, which is clearly an enormous amount of time spent watching the boob tube. And the relative risk for obesity increases along with that to about twofold. Now, that's a much greater increase in the hours watched compared to the risks of obesity, but it is correlated. It's an association. Now, showing that you can do the reverse, increase physical activity sufficiently to induce weight loss and reverse obesity, is a much harder thing to do and to show. And at least, unless we're looking at folks who are consuming many hours a day in physical activity, 4+ hours a day, it's hard to demonstrate that you can reverse it successfully with exercise alone without restricting food intake. So this is a slide I stole from an investigator named Len Epstein, and he writes that it could be worse for your heart than cholesterol having a recliner. All right, there are other factors in the environment that matter. So for instance, the season of the year seems to affect how much weight we gain. So here's a paper that we did a number of years ago showing that the winter holiday season that is fortunately just concluded, from Thanksgiving through New Year's, and I guess we can consider through the Super Bowl, is associated with a greater weight change than any other period of the year. This was a study in which we measured about 200 folks throughout the entire year. And this was the only time where it was actually significantly different from zero. Virtually all the weight that's gained from year to year can be accounted for by this period of time in the holiday season. However, we're still just talking about a pound a year, a little less than a pound a year actually on average in this study. So we know that many people are gaining much more than a pound a year, and developing obesity doesn't happen except over a very long time frame with just a pound a year change. So again, we'll ask the question, why do people become obese? We think changes in our environment may explain why obesity has become more common over the last 40 years, for sure, because our genes didn't change. But our genes make us respond to our current environment by becoming obese. So there's a famous statement that's made that the genetics that we have load the gun of obesity, but the environment pulls the trigger. I think that's a reasonable simile for what's going on, that we are born with a set of predispositions, including for obesity, for many in this room, a predisposition to do research, and the opportunity, being at NIH to do research and being in a calorie-dense environment, those are both factors that lead us to certain choices. However, we know that genetics really do matter. So here are a group of identical twins and fraternal twins. So these folks share all of their genome, and the fraternal twins only about 50% on average of their genomes. You'll see, of course, that the height is quite different in many of the pairs of fraternal twins, but of course very similar in the identical twins. Nobody's surprised by that. But now let's look in the other dimension, the girth of folks. You see folks that are quite discordant in how obese they are for the fraternal twins, but for the identical twins, they really do line up very well. And that really speaks to that genetic importance for determining body weight. We also know that another way of looking at the risk for genetics affecting obesity is to consider how parents' obesity is associated with their children's obesity. These are data that Garn and Clark put together in the 1970s, showing that if you had two lean parents, your triceps fat fold would be much lower than if you had two obese parents. And part of this might have been the environment in the family, but most of it turns out to have been genetically determined. So let's turn to a patient. Here's one fellow that we have seen at NIH and followed over several years. He's 14 years old. His weight is 166 kilos, so over 300 pounds. His body mass index is 56, so well over that 30 mark for obesity. And he has high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, so high cholesterol, and slightly high glucose levels. And he also has some pains in his lower extremities that are due to his weight. So this is someone who clearly we would like to know how he became so heavy at such an early age, and also think about how we might be able to reverse that. So that brings us to the differential diagnosis of obesity. We'll just briefly talk about some of these other categories besides genetics. So there are endocrine conditions that can cause obesity. There are medicines that can affect obesity. You can have a damaged brain, so hypothalamic damage that we won't really talk about anymore. And then in terms of genetics, we'll talk about some very established syndromes, and then some of the newer syndromes that affect the leptin signaling pathway, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So first, the classical endocrinologic disorders that cause obesity. People talk about hypothyroidism, low thyroid, as a cause of obesity because low thyroid is a low metabolic state. But in general, most of the weight that's actually gained in thyroid disease is water weight. and the reversal of that does not change body fat very dramatically. However, treatment does improve appearance quite dramatically, as you can see in these two before and after pictures. High cortisol levels, so what's called Cushing's syndrome, is a very rare condition. In children, it's 1 in 10,000. In adults, it's 1 in 1 in 10 million. In adults, it's 1 in a million. And you can see very clearly that if you reverse a tumor that produces too much cortisol, you can reverse obesity quite successfully. So that means we can, account for just a few patients in the world. And then people who, again, have a very rare condition of high blood insulin from a tumor in the pancreas that causes hypoglycemia, so people try to eat to raise the blood sugar, that also is associated with obesity, and that's again a 1 in 10 million kind of disorder. So endocrine conditions, which my glands that are the problem, are really not the common cause of obesity. Some medicines are indeed associated with pediatric and adult obesity, so glucocorticoids which increase cortisol action, a lot of psychotropic agents, antipsychotic drugs, mood stabilizers like lithium, antidepressants, some of the older ones particularly, anticonvulsants that are used to treat epilepsy, and then other drugs that can cause weight gain include antihypertensive like propranolol, a beta blocker, a very common drug, or clonidine. These are all medicines that we should be thinking about as causes of obesity in folks who otherwise might not have a high risk for it. And then there are these very distinctive genetic syndromes associated with obesity. Perhaps the most common genetic disorder of them all, Down syndrome, trisomy 21, but some others, Prader-Willi syndrome and Bardet-Biedl syndrome, and others even more rare, and the Turner syndrome. I'll just talk about a couple of these. So here's a patient with Down syndrome. He has an extra copy of chromosome 21 shown here. They have very distinct ears and these palmar creases, special spots in the eye and this epicanthal fold, but obesity is very common, and it's not really clear why that is the case. The Prader-Willi syndrome is unique because it's associated with poor feeding and actually failure to thrive in the first couple of years of life. And then after about age 2, obesity and development of an insatiable appetite. And it's associated with abnormalities of a particular chromosomal region caused by deletion of the paternal gene, or what's called uniparental disomy, where you have 2 copies of mother's gene because the mother's gene is usually inactive. And then there can be an abnormal methylation that again inactivates the normally active copy. And it gets to the point where such a severe obesity and drive to eat that folks have to lock their refrigerators up to prevent the folks from raiding the refrigerator. So this is a very severe hyperphagic condition. And then the Bardet-Biedl syndrome is another very easily recognizable condition because in addition to the obesity, there's retinal degeneration, extra digits in the hands and the feet, so your 6 toes and an extra digit here in the hands, and genital hypoplasia and mental retardation being quite common as well. These are distinct syndromes, relatively easy to recognize if they're thought about. But some of the newer genetic syndromes associated with obesity that have to do with this drug, this hormone called leptin, have very few differences in people's appearance. And so I thought I'd talk about a few of them. They're listed here, but I think I'll switch next to talking about what is leptin. Leptin is a substance that's made by fat and circulates in the body and is the cause of the obesity in a particular mouse model called the OB mouse. This mouse was suspected to have a hormonal cause of obesity because if you linked the circulation of such mice to normal mice, they would develop normal body weight. So it was known that there was a circulating factor that could cause this disorder. And the discovery that leptin was the hormone that these animals lacked was a transforming event in obesity research, happened in 1994, that really opened up a whole system of diseases that were caused by deficiencies in the leptin signaling pathway in the brain. So let's go to a very simple version of that. So leptin here is made by fat cells. It circulates in the blood. The main place it acts, not the only place, but the main place is in the hypothalamus at its own distinct special leptin receptors that are cytokine-like receptors. For those of you who are interested, they use JAK-STAT signaling. Then there are first-order neurons that contain these receptors that then eventually lead to changes in other neurotransmitters in the brain, like alpha MSH and neuropeptide Y, that can bind to their own distinct receptors and affect things like appetite, hormones, the autonomic nervous system, and food, and actually work mostly through their own systems, other neurons there are third and fourth and fifth order neurons that some of which are beginning to be elucidated. We're going to start here then to just show you or think about patients who are leptin deficient. The first description was back in 97, two cousins from a consanguineous family, so they inherited the same bad leptin gene. They were normal at birth but had very rapid weight gain and were found to have a very low leptin level despite a high percentage of body fat. And they had a single base deletion in the leptin gene, introducing a premature stop codon, so they didn't make circulating leptin. So this is what their blood leptins look like. So if they measured leptin in the plasma, they have very low levels. And since it's made by fat in proportion to how much fat the person has normally, we can see what normal leptin looks like in proportion to these folks who have a leptin mutation. So we now know about 20 or 25 people who have leptin mutations leading to this kind of low level of leptin. And as we'll talk about, we know how to treat them as well. So here's a child with leptin deficiency, severe early onset obesity, so the weight is outside the 98th percentile by about 6 months of age, and this is what's described in general for these folks. Severe obesity, so this child weighs almost 100 kilos, over 200 pounds before the age of 10. So severe early onset obesity. And that can be reversed by leptin treatment, first shown in animals. So here's a leptin deficient mouse, and then this one's been treated with leptin, and it's a really remarkable treatment to reverse the obesity of leptin deficiency. And the same is true for children who have leptin deficiency. This is the same kid I showed you before, and a couple years later, this child has lost a great deal of body fat, and of course gained some height as well because its time has passed. Now, unfortunately, there's little efficacy of leptin in obese humans who are not leptin deficient. Here's a big clinical trial using something called metroleptin, a long-acting form of leptin or placebo, showing that the changes in body weight over time are really the same in those who got placebo or those who got leptin. So there's not a great deal of efficacy of leptin in individuals who are already obese, and that's because, as I showed you before, they tend to have high leptin levels already. So their leptin receptors are pretty much maximally stimulated by their high leptin concentrations. That doesn't mean that if they lose weight and lower those endogenous leptin levels, that extra leptin won't change their physiology. We won't have time to talk about those very interesting experiments. But in general, for the purpose of inducing weight loss, it doesn't look like leptin is a remarkable drug for the most of us. Okay, so if leptin is not deficient, which it is not in most cases, it's binding at its own hypothalamic leptin receptors and leptin receptors elsewhere. And you can imagine there must be individuals who are also missing those receptors. And sure enough, they're also having early onset obesity and very high leptin levels, in this case, at least in most of those patients. And they actually fail to enter puberty normally because in the absence of the leptin receptor, the hypothalamus thinks that the body is starving. And one of the responses to starvation is to turn down reproduction. So children with this disorder don't spontaneously enter into puberty. Now, do they respond to severely restrictive diets, a 500 kcal diet? Yes, but as soon as that diet stops, the weight continues. And again, this person has a weight measurement that is measured on the height curve, not on the weight curves. That's considered a bad sign. Now, as I said, patients with leptin receptor deficiency in general have significantly higher leptin levels, hyperleptinemia. So values that might be as high as 100 nanograms per mil versus controls equally obese, that would be about 40 or 50. And we've actually discovered a family like this with leptin receptor deficiency. Early onset obesity, this is one of the two kids, two siblings. Only one of their parents was even moderately obese, and they had high leptin even for obese children. And sure enough, they came from a consanguineous marriage where the parents were second cousins. And two of the children were affected with the same mutation. This is, and I'll show you what we looked at, whole exome sequencing actually to find them. There were a lot of shared nucleotide variants, almost 5,000 recessive changes that could have been significant. But if we filtered by pathogenicity and conservation, we were able to get it down to 15 potentially damaging variants. And one very remarkable homozygous leptin receptor change that clearly was the cause. It's this cause right here, a premature stop codon after insertion of 9 novel amino acids in the leptin receptor. So we can find individuals like this, but they're, again, vanishingly rare, and there are less than 40 individuals, families, that have been detected with this leptin receptor complete deficiency. Heterozygotes are not remarkably obese, either for leptin deficiency or leptin receptor deficiency. And really interestingly to us, there are some folks who have as high leptin levels as those with leptin receptor deficiency, but their leptin receptors are completely normal. So who are these folks? Well, maybe they're folks who have problems downstream of the leptin receptor that are causing feedback regulation troubles, so the leptin levels are increased. And one such case we think might be the Bardet-Biedl syndrome. I mentioned this before, that it has this retinal degeneration in the extra digits. It's actually caused by many different genes, and the BBS proteins appear to be essential for normal function of what's called the primary cilium. So here's the normal wild-type cilium. Every cell actually has a little cilium like this on it. It helps orient the cell properly in space and also moves things around the cell, what is called intraflagellar transport. And one particular mutation that's found in humans is M390R, causes, if you will, an obese version of the cilium here. And what's interesting for us is that when you inactivate these proteins in mice, they lead to aberrant leptin receptor trafficking in hypothalamic neurons, impaired leptin signaling, and high leptin levels in the mice. So we found the same to be true in the humans. Those with Bardet-Biedl syndrome had much higher leptin levels adjusted for their fat mass than obese controls. So we think that it's possible there may be some folks who can be identified by their hyperleptinemia for having disorders in the proximal leptin signaling pathways. Okay, so if the leptin receptors are okay, but there's still a problem in the leptin signaling, where might it be? Well, there's an enzyme that, there's a gene called POMC, which makes many molecules, including this hormone neurotransmitter alpha MSH, and mutations in POMC have been associated with obesity. So if you disrupt the formation of this alpha MSH, for instance, these two mutations, so you can't make alpha MSH, you can develop a person such as this individual. Now, alpha MSH can't be processed properly, nor can ACTH be made, or beta endorphin. The absence of alpha MSH throughout the body causes the sort of pale skin and reddish hair, because alpha MSH works at a receptor called the melanocortin-1 receptor in the body to regulate skin and hair color. These patients have adrenal insufficiency and very small adrenals, adrenal hypoplasia, because ACTH can't be made. That's action at the melanocortin-2 receptor that normally makes cortisol. But even when they're properly replaced with cortisol, they have obesity because the alpha MSH doesn't work at this other receptor called the melanocortin-4 receptor. So let's look at these melanocortin receptors. Oh, before we get there, one more genetic disease to tell you about, another very rare condition. This is the prohormone convertase 1, a gene that processes pro-opiomelanocortin into alpha MSH, but also processes other hormones. And if you disrupt the normal places where prohormone convertase 1 acts, these 4 places there, then you can't make any of these molecules, and you have a very high level of pro-opiomelanocortin floating around. So these folks have early onset obesity, and the abnormal post-translational hormone processing leads to a whole series of defects, problems with the gonads, low cortisol, low regular insulin, high proinsulin, and high pro-opiomelanocortin levels. Again, a very rare condition, case reports really describing the disease. But the most common disorders of the leptin signaling pathway associated with obesity are problems with the melanocortin receptors. So based on knockout animals, mice animals, we knew that if we knock out the melanocortin-4 receptor in a mouse, it produces an obese mouse, and it's a hyperphagic mouse that eats more calories than it takes in. So not surprisingly, there are a few humans that do this as well. So here's a 9-year-old with a homozygous melanocortin-4 receptor inactivating mutation, and his 16-year-old normal brother, severe obesity, and actually increased height, at least early on. And these have been looked for very actively, and it turns out that perhaps 2.5% of severely obese individuals, at least early onset obese individuals, may have at least heterozygous mutations of the melanocortin-4 receptor. So this makes it the most common disorder that we know that with a genetic cause associated with obesity. And also there's another receptor in the brain called the melanocortin-3 receptor, where the mouse is also an obese mouse compared to the normal mouse. And it's an interesting mouse from our perspective because it changes body composition to have increased fat mass and reduced lean mass. And actually, for the calories that they take in, they do turn more of them into fat. That's higher feeding efficiency. And so we've looked for mutations in that, and we found a pair of polymorphisms that I won't really go into a great deal that seem to be associated with obesity. They're more common in African Americans and Caucasians associated with greater fat mass as well as body mass index. And we've knocked them into mice, and now we can see that the mouse here is also an obese mouse if they have this double mutant human receptor. So here's the greater fat mass in this mouse compared to the smaller amount of fat in the wild type human knock-in mouse. And we're currently trying to understand better as to why this mouse is so obese. And maybe I'll come back in a few years and be able to tell you more about that story. So after that long discussion of some of the genetic causes of obesity, just a few, because we think there are probably on the order of 300 or more genes that impact energy regulation and body weight. Let's come back to our patient and give you some data. So here's our patient's plasma leptin. It's right in line with all the other obese children that I show you here. So it doesn't have a problem of too high or too low leptin. It turned out that this patient had a function-altering variant of the melanocortin-3 receptor, the last thing I showed you, had hyperinsulinemia and hypercholesterolemia. So how should we treat him? We don't really have a specific treatment yet for most of these variants of obesity besides the leptin-deficient individual. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that people with a BMI over the 95th percentile, even if they just have some mild complications, should have weight loss. Unfortunately, they don't really tell us how to do that. In my research group, we've spent a lot of time trying to work on how to induce weight loss in severely obese children. We carried out a randomized placebo-controlled trial of a drug called orlistat, which is a relatively modest weight loss inducing medicine. He actually did rather well, lost 7 kilos over the first 3 months of treatment. Then, of course, the weight loss slows down and lost just 2 kilos over the next 3 months. And then, unfortunately, he regained all of his lost weight over the next 24 months when he was no longer in the intensive program. And perhaps Kevin will have something to say about why that would occur. So I'm going to stop there, and are we going to do questions after both speakers, or now? After both speakers, okay. So thank you very much. Oh, you want to do questions? All right. Okay, I'll come back.
So what happens in some of these patients with the leptin receptor deficiency? Do they have resting energy metabolism? I learned a little bit about some of these issues when I participated in a clinical trial for 5 years. And as I found out that my resting energy metabolism is about 1300. And then after 5 years, it came to about 1200. As I was getting older, I guess from 69 to almost 74. So I guess this is a losing battle right now. If I don't do anything else, I burn about 1250. So anything above that, I had to burn. So what happens in some of these patients with some of the receptor mutations in terms of their resting energy metabolism?
So the question is really what happens in these genetic abnormalities to resting energy expenditures. So first, just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about, if you're lying at rest and we just measure how many calories you burn, there'll be a certain amount required to have your heart pump and have your brain function. And if you've eaten a meal, your guts will have to peristalse and break down calories. So that burns calories at a little higher than just resting. If you're fully asleep, your brain is perhaps a little less active, at least your body certainly is. And so the sleeping metabolic rate is a little lower than what's just at rest. Anyway, that turns out to be, in most people, about two-thirds of the calories that are burned each day. Of course, that really can vary tremendously depending on whether someone is very physically active or not, because physical activity can vary tremendously from hour to hour, from moment to moment, from person to person. So resting energy metabolism is one of the things that people look at that might be affected in situations and lead to obesity, or if they were high enough, prevent obesity. The stories for resting energy metabolism is interesting in that if people try to lose weight, that's one of the things that changes quite dramatically as they're acutely losing weight. That the wisdom of the body is you're not supposed to lose weight. So all of the systems are turned down to lead to weight regain, and those include resting energy metabolism. We think one of the factors certainly that changes as you lose weight very acutely is the leptin concentration in the blood. So if you stop eating for a day, leptin drops dramatically right away. However, interestingly, adding back leptin to these people who have leptin deficiency, genetic leptin deficiency, doesn't cause tremendous changes in energy metabolism as much as you might imagine. In the mouse models, however, it's pretty clear that it does. Now, that may just be that we don't have enough humans with sufficient precision to see those effects. Where it has been shown to be effective is after individuals who have the ability to make leptin lose weight, are stabilized at a new weight in an inpatient setting where they know exactly how many calories are consumed and how much energy is expended. And then replacement of leptin does have subtle effects on the ability of the body to use energy. So people become very efficient at using energy when they lose weight, and leptin actually makes them a little less energy efficient. At least that's the current belief.
Thank you.
I think it's not well shown, but and it should be replicated in more than one center. But it's believed that there might be this role.
Yeah, I came in a moment or so late, so please stop me if you address this. I've always been taken with the fact that BMI seems to be a one-size-fits-all indicator. And although you can find some sites which factor in age and gender, they're few. And body size, bone density, muscle density seems to be quite off. Now, I never consider myself terribly obese. But right now, my BMI says I'm about 20 pounds overweight in order to be normal. And I don't look at myself as 20 pounds overweight, maybe some do. So I'm wondering what your view of the adequacy of BMI. And that, by the way, is one that adjusts for my age and gender.
Right. So I guess to
He's
restate
my
the
tennis
question.
partner, and he plays rigorous tennis. You should know that.
So that will help you in the long run, playing tennis. So the body mass index is a surrogate measure. It's supposed to be a screening tool that we use in clinical practice to try to identify people who might be at greater risk. What I mentioned is that it's a marker of body fatness, but it's not a very perfect marker. Maybe I can come back to this slide. Where we're just looking at body fatness versus BMI in men and women. Now, if we go to any particular BMI, we can have folks here who have a body fatness of only 10% or 40%. So you know that it's not a wonderful tool. But on average, it reflects body fatness. So it's a reasonable screening tool for us to consider. Now, is everyone going to go have a detailed study of their body fatness with a DEXA scan, an expensive test? No, we're not going to do that. Instead, we try to use surrogate measures like BMI to direct ourselves to who we might want to look at. Now, when you said you were 20 pounds overweight, that probably puts you in this BMI of 25, 26, something in that range. And so that is making an assumption that normal weight is BMI of 23, and that is in fact the most advantageous weight to have in terms of your health. I think more and more data are accumulating that suggests that at least for older individuals, there are no tremendous disadvantages to having a body mass index even in the 27 range or 28 range. It's really when you're much over 30 that you can demonstrate the big increases in mortality. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't morbidities that develop even in this range. I didn't bring a slide of this with me, but even within the 25 to 30 range, there is an increasing risk of diabetes developing even in that very mildly overweight range. So we know that their risk of complications goes up, particularly diabetes, even within that relatively healthy range for dying. So that means that while we might not die at having a little extra weight, we might not be as healthy as we would like to be. And there may be other conditions like arthritic conditions that could be reversed if we were at a lower body weight. Of course, we don't want to go too far the other way, and that's one of the problems of aging, that even staying at exactly the same body weight, lean mass, the metabolically active weight, tends to decrease over time, unless you keep vigorously doing your tennis game.
Well, let me ask you, there's very elegant cell biology work done here at the NIH and elsewhere concerning the regulation of mitochondrial structure and metabolism in relationship to stress and caloric deprivation. Have any studies of that kind been done with any of the animal models, or let alone the human models of obesity syndromes? Are these disorders manifested by similar dysregulation of mitochondrial structure and function? Do we know that?
It's a very good question. How much do we know about the link between mitochondrial energy metabolism dysfunction and obesity? I'm pretty sure there's some animal models that have been done that demonstrate that it's possible to affect energy metabolism in this fashion. The human models, I'm not sure how much has been shown, but it's not something that I've spent any time researching, and there may be others in the audience who would be able to answer this question much better than I.
Arnold? Do you know, are there any studies of using animals with these?
I can tell you it's not one of the top hits on our genome-wide associations for obesity. None of the mitochondrial genes has shown up. So we don't think that common variation is going to be a major contributor. But every time we increase the sample size to 2 million, 5 million people, then we can identify more genes or gene loci that are associated with body weight regulation. So it wouldn't surprise me in the least if we can demonstrate that more clearly. I can tell you that at one point we tried to look for variation in mitochondrial genes in association with resting energy metabolism, and were unable to find any links to explain some variants that we had seen in energy rates. But that doesn't mean that it's not there.
Well, there seems to be more true in the cancer literature, the cancer cell biology literature related to tumor lines and so forth. At any rate, there'll be time for more questions, but I think we should move along. So, Kevin, thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
So thanks for the invitation to present here. I was telling Wynn earlier that when I first arrived at the NIH, I have a physics degree, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about the broad scope of the kinds of work that's being done at NIH, and a little bit of more medical knowledge. And I attended pretty regularly with one of the early versions of this course, I guess. So it's an honor to be here, and also to share the podium with Jack, who I've been following his research since I got here as well. And I've been given the task of talking about why weight loss is difficult. And I actually want to set this up a little bit by, some initial surprise that I had when I was sitting in on a counseling session, a dietary counseling session with an obese patient at the clinical center with a dietitian who's since moved on to other places. And she was just giving some really good diet advice, and she made this calculation for this person, which I thought was really interesting. She talked about looking at their diet records and saying, oh, well, it looks like you drink, a few cans of soda a day, full sort of calorie soda. And, if you were to just cut that down by, instead of drinking 3 cans a day, just drink, 1 can a day and replace it with diet soda, you'd lose all this weight after a year. And I didn't, and so afterwards I said, where did you get that number from? How did you calculate how much weight this person would lose? And she said, oh, it's in every nutrition textbook. It's in every dietetics textbook. In fact, we're tested on this idea at our licensing exams. And so it turned out that, this is everywhere. I looked this up, and this was the previous practical guide for the identification, evaluation, and treatment of overweight and obesity in adults. This was the NHLBI Education Initiative back in 2000. This was just updated and published in the journal Obesity, as well as Circulation, I believe. But the old rule of thumb was if you cut 500 to 1,000 calories per day, which is, I say calories, and most people talk about calories, it's really kilocalories in nutrition. That'll produce this recommended weight loss of 1 to 2 pounds per week, okay? And that's just supposed to continue on, I guess. You know, you cut it 500 calories out of your diet, you lose a pound a week, so that's like 50 pounds in a year. That's great. 2 years, that's 100 pounds of weight loss. You know, it's got to stop somewhere, right? And so I was really interested in trying to find out what is the, you know, what's the scientific basis behind this rule of thumb. And it turns out that it's this magic number, 3,500 kilocalories per pound. And it took me actually months and months to figure out where this number came from and how it was being applied in this way. And I finally tracked it down to a paper that was published in the 1950s by this physiologist named Max Yanovski. I think he was a physiologist, maybe he was a clinician, I'm not sure. But it turned out that basically what he did was take biopsies of human fat tissue. And he basically put them in a bomb calorimeter and saw how many calories were in the fat tissue. And he basically found out that there was 3,500 calories of energy stored in human fat tissue. And you know, you might know that there's that's not a translation into actual triglyceride, because fat tissue actually has water and protein and lots of other stuff in it. And so it's diluted by these non-caloric equivalents, and you get this 3,500 kilocalories per pound idea. And so the idea then was, okay, well, when you lose weight, you just lose fat tissue. That was assumption number one. Now, it turns out that's not true. You lose lean tissues as well as fat tissues when you lose weight. And assumption number two was when you go on a diet, nothing happens to the number of calories that you burn. Those are the two assumptions underlying the use of this rule as it's you know, stated in this particular handbook, and practically other. If you Google how many calories to lose weight, you'll find millions of hits that will basically cite this rule of thumb. And it's actually been applied not just for individual subjects, but people have put out policy implications of this. So this was a 2010 report by the USDA that was investigating the sort of population-wide idea that this dietitian was recommending on an individual basis. What would happen if we were to somehow make people drink less soda? And in fact, we could tax them. That might be one way that we could make people drink less soda. And they were actually very brave, because they were economists who were talking about, well, if we were to tax people's soda by 20%, then they're going to compensate by drinking more of these other things. And they worked out this very fancy economics argument. And they came up at the end of the day that they would decrease their energy intake by 40 kilocalories per day. So it doesn't sound like a lot. But when you apply the 3,500 calorie per pound rule to the average weight of an adult in recent years, this is what you get. And they actually said this in this report. They said that you would get about this rate of weight loss. What they didn't say, they didn't plot this figure. I plotted the figure, but basically what that means is that you take the average weight of adults during the height of the obesity epidemic, you tax all their sodas, and you wait 5 years, and you come back to before there was an obesity epidemic. That's characteristic of the weight of the 1970s, about a 10-kilo weight loss. So, you know, something is wrong with this, right? And people were making recommendations and promising all sorts of public health consequences to particular policies. And so my background's in physics. I build mathematical models for a living, and I thought, you know, maybe if we knew something about how those assumptions are actually wrong, and we could actually quantify how far off they're wrong. You know, how much of a weight change actually comes from fat tissue versus lean tissue, and how do those changing body composition and changing metabolic rate that actually change over time, how does that quantifiably dictate the dynamics of weight change over time for a given intervention. And so that was the idea of my research program. And so I built a model. These are the equations for one of the models that's the more complex one of several models that we built. This one accounts for different macronutrients, carbohydrate, fat, and protein, and how they interact in the body, how they're regulated by the diet, and how changing the macronutrient structure of your diet will change how much fat you're burning versus carbohydrate, et cetera, how that filters down into changes in the detailed chemical composition of the body. I'm not going to walk through all this, obviously. If you're really interested in reading about it, you can read about it in these 2 American Journal of Physiology papers. But what you're more interested in is, okay, now that you've built this model, can you do any better than that silly 3,500 calorie per pound rule? In other words, let's make some predictions about independent experiments that weren't used to build the model, but we know what people were eating. And don't change any parameters of the model and just compare the model predictions to the results of those experiments. So the only thing I'm allowed to change is the initial conditions of the model to match whatever the subject population was in the experiment. So if I'm studying lean men, I get to start the model off with the characteristic body composition, resting metabolic rate that we already talked about before of a lean man. And we feed that lean man with whatever was fed in a study and compare the predictions with the results. So we've done this in these 2 papers with over a dozen different kinds of experiments. Overfeeding experiments, underfeeding experiments, men, women, lean, obese, varying the macronutrient contents of the diet. And we've shown that it's pretty accurate. It does a pretty good job of simulating the differences between those individuals once you account for their baseline body composition changes and metabolic parameters. What I wanted to show you was one example that's not in those 2 papers and actually alludes to an experiment that Jack has mentioned a couple times in his talk. This was a classic study by Rudy Leibel, Michael Rosenbaum, and Jewel Hirsch at Columbia University, now at Columbia University. This was at the Rockefeller, published in the New England Journal in 1995. And what they did was they took some folks, very obese folks, brought them in as inpatients for many, many months, that's like 9 months of time, and fed them this, as Michael Rosenbaum likes to call it, a horrible liquid diet. So they only get to drink this really bland tasting liquid diet, and they can know exactly how many calories they're consuming because they don't leave, and they know they can measure the calories in this liquid diet very easily. And so what they do is they basically start them off, they know they're eating around 3,000 calories a day normally, and they put them on about 900 calories a day of this liquid diet until they lose 10% of their body weight. And then they ramp up the number of calories in the same liquid diet so that they maintain perfect weight stability for many weeks, okay? And they measure some metabolic parameters and body composition. And then they do exactly the same thing all over again until they lose 20% of the weight loss, and then they balance them off at this new state. So we took our model, started them off as the average obese subject in this particular study, and then just fed them this curve for energy intake, and then we'll compare the results. And a couple things I want to point out here. So the curves here are the model predictions, the data points are the boxes. And a couple things are interesting, and Jack alluded to this. Right away, when you go into this energy deficit, the number of calories that you're burning slows down dramatically. At least that's what the model predicts. And it finally sort of has a slow period where it's slowly declining as you're losing weight. And then as you reestablish that new body weight, that kind of picks up again. And they don't have a dynamic measurement. So this is kind of the period of active weight loss, and this is the period of weight stability. They don't have that measurement during active weight loss for total energy expenditure, but they do have it for resting metabolic rate. You can see that those sorts of dynamics are occurring in the data as well. And then when they did it again, you basically see the same sort of thing. So first of all, it's a horrible assumption that nothing happens to the number of calories that you're burning when you go on a diet, right? Otherwise, that blue line and that red line and the green line, which is the energy cost for physical activity, should just be completely horizontal, right? That's clearly not what's happening. And the second thing I'd like to point out is that the model does a reasonably good job of matching the data here in terms of the dynamics of total energy expenditure and resting metabolic rate. And in terms of body composition and weight change, the model predicts both the right amount of weight change and the right composition of that weight change. That's coming both from fat mass and fat-free mass, the sort of lean tissues of the body, if you want to think about it that way. Interestingly, if you then compare what the 3,500 calorie per pound rule would predict, you're more than 40 pounds off the mark by the end, right? It predicts more than 40 pounds more weight loss after these several months than were actually observed. So pretty poor prediction. Okay, so now that you've got this model, let's apply it to some other data that we actually were interested in, trying to understand what was happening in the folks who were competing on this nationally televised weight loss competition called The Biggest Loser. How many people have watched this show or seen this show? Okay, so most people have seen it. I'm one of the people who probably, I don't know where I fell into Jack's hours of television on the x-axis. I'm probably at the upper end, not quite 40 hours per week, but it's my guilty pleasure is reality television. And after one day, long day in the lab, I came home and I turned on the television, and it was at the tail end of the Biggest Loser competition. And I saw that people were losing, 10, 15, 20 pounds per week. I was like, what the heck is going on in this program? I don't understand, what's happening here. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to make a point of watching this show the next week. And it basically showed a bunch of overweight people getting yelled at by personal trainers on, and what I didn't see was, much information about what they were eating, because I guess it's kind of hard to videotape people not eating, right? I mean, it's not a very entertaining television. So I decided to call up I found the producer online. I did some searching and found the name of the producer who produced the show, and I phoned him and I said, this is Dr. Hall from the NIH calling, and I'd like to talk to the doctor who's in charge of the care of these folks. And it's like, oh, absolutely. And he put me in touch with Rob Huizenga, who's the middle author on this paper that we eventually published. And he was actually doing very careful tracking of their body composition change. But he didn't have any measurements of energy metabolism. In other words, how many calories these folks were burning, both at rest and during these extreme amounts of activity. And one of the things that we know about is that we think we know about, this is one of the things about this area of research, is there's lots of mythology out there, and lots of people think they know things that are accepted fact, but when you actually dig into the details, you find out that the basis for these beliefs is not quite what you thought or hoped they would be. But one of the ideas is that if you have a lot of vigorous exercise, you could prevent the loss of fat-free mass. You could kind of keep your lean tissues high. And as Jack mentioned earlier, the metabolic rate that slows down when you lose weight, well, one of the things that's believed is that the biggest driver of that resting metabolic rate is how much lean tissue you have, how much lean energy requiring tissues you have. So the theory was, well, if these folks are losing weight and doing all this resistance exercise and going from, this is by the way the same person who lost about 240 pounds over 7 months, this is one of our study subjects, he goes from very obese to basically only moderately overweight according to the BMI estimates, and actually in the normal range according to body fat. Does he preserve lean mass, number one? And if he does that prevent the fall in resting metabolic rate that I showed you in the previous case with diet alone? Okay, so that was the purpose of looking at these folks. And I was able to recruit Darcy Johansson, who was at the time a postdoc of Eric Ravusin at the Pennington Center, and she, along with me, helped convince Eric that it was worthwhile studying these folks. So we basically went out to this place and we said, okay, let's measure metabolic rate both at rest and their total energy expenditure, along with their body composition change, and let's see if they're able to prevent this fall in metabolic rate as a result of keeping their lean tissue. And the answer was no, they couldn't. This is plotting the adjusted metabolic rate once you adjust for age and sex and fat mass against the biggest driver of cross-sectional resting metabolic rate, which is fat-free mass. And the closed circles are before, and this is the regression line of the before data. And that's actually perfectly normal if you plot that over top of a cross-sectional data set, it also looks very much like that. It's no different in terms of its slope or intercept. But you can see that with respect to their loss in weight, once they lose weight, they fall off that curve. They're all below the curve. And only this one person seemed to kind of gain a very slight amount of resting metabolic rate. Everybody else dropped like a rock. On average, the drop in resting metabolic rate was 800 calories a day. And that was 500 calories a day more than would be expected based on their weight change. So this idea of keeping their lean tissue mass up, if it happened, did not prevent the slowing of metabolism that occurred. So this is what happened on average to the body weight and fat mass over the course of this intervention. And for the first 13 weeks, they're isolated on this ranch, away from their families, away from their daily activities. And then they're basically told, go home and keep this up. And so they're losing about 1 pound a day during the period of time they're on the ranch, and then the rate of weight loss decreases to about half that, but it's still a pretty good clip, about 0.5 pound a day when they go home. And you can see that the model here are the curves are predicting the right amount of fat mass change and the right amount of body weight change over this period of time. And in terms of the total energy expenditure, you can see that they're starting off before the study. We actually had a measurement before they knew that they were on the television show, so we have baseline data before they were being filmed. And they were eating and burning around 3,700 calories per day. And that jumped up quite a bit at 6 weeks into the intervention. And then by the end, they're actually quite a bit lower than that. The resting metabolic, so the exercise, they're basically sedentary beforehand. They didn't have any exercise program. We simulated this sort of slow ramp up of exercise, a relatively slow ramp up of exercise, which then dropped once they went home. Now this is the calories expended with exercise. And that's a little bit distinct from the amount of exercise because most exercises are weight bearing. And therefore, as you lose weight, to do the same amount of exercise, you actually cost less calories. So remember, by the end here, they're about 60 kilos lower in body weight than they were to start with. So they're actually still doing about an hour a day of vigorous exercise during the at-home period, whereas here, this corresponds to about 3 hours of vigorous exercise every day. Resting metabolic rate fell, just like I mentioned before, and the model captured that. And then we could actually make a prediction about what they must have been eating, because we didn't have the facilities to actually measure directly what they were eating or control it in the same way that Rudy Leibel's folks had done with their inpatients. But they were eating about 1,100 calories per day while doing, burning about 5,000 calories per day over the course of that period of time. So very severe negative energy deficit during this particular study. So because we built this model, we could then do simulated experiments and ask the question about, well, what would have happened if they'd just done the diet or just done the exercise? So it's a hypothetical, it's speculation, but I thought it was kind of interesting to look at because if you look at the diet alone, just they did that black curve, that energy intake corresponding to the diet alone, you lose more weight than you would if you did the exercise alone and clamped your diet at baseline. But they would have lost less fat mass. So the white bar is the predicted fat mass change. The black bar is the predicted body weight change. And you can see that in the exercise alone group, they lose more fat than they do body weight. So they actually gain some lean mass. Okay, that's this computer simulation. Whereas with the diet alone, it's basically 2/3 is coming from fat mass and about 1/3 comes from lean mass loss. And that's actually what's typically observed in bariatric surgery patients. So they tend to lose quite a bit of lean tissue. And while that probably doesn't prevent that preservation of lean tissue may not prevent a fall in resting metabolic rate, there's other reasons you want to keep around your muscle tissue, right? You want to actually be able to walk around and avoid falling down as you get older and very practical things like that. So this was just a computer simulation, but then what we decided to do was go and do some retrospective pair matching of Biggest Loser contestants with people who had very similar initial body composition. Sex is a pair matched for sex, age, and body composition with folks who underwent Roux-en-Y gastric bypass surgery, and compared the amount of weight loss that was coming from fat versus fat-free mass in these groups. So it turns out that you get similar amounts of weight loss after a year of Roux-en-Y gastric bypass as you do in 7 months on this Biggest Loser program, but the proportion is quite a bit different. So it's significantly more fat-free mass loss after Roux-en-Y gastric bypass compared to this Biggest Loser group. So, we're pretty confident that yes, if you add all this vigorous exercise, this is one bit of mythology that we actually believe is true, you will prevent the fall in fat-free mass. Whether or not that does anything for your resting metabolic rate is, I think, still a question. So we could actually plot then that metabolic adaptation, that greater than expected change in metabolic rate that's observed once you adjust for the change in weight and the change in fat mass and fat-free mass. And we did this with the Roux-en-Y bariatric surgery group, who we had data at 6 months as well as the 12 months. And you can see that in both groups, during the sort of active weight loss phase, there is pretty dramatic slowing of metabolism that takes place. So about 400 calories a day, greater than would be expected based on the weight change and the fat mass change alone. Once the bariatric surgery folks are kind of starting to stabilize their body weight after 12 months or so, that is reduced substantially, but it's still not zero. What we did was then look at the individual subjects and tried to ask the question of what are the best predictors of that greater than expected slowing of metabolism. And two things really popped out. One was the degree of energy imbalance. So in other words, what was the degree of deficit that was actually achieved over the course of the intervention? And so for some folks, that averaged upwards of 3,000 calories per day. Others, it was as little as about 400 calories a day. And there was a nice correlation between these two factors. And then the other one that correlated quite well was the change in circulating leptin. So something we talked about before. So if you have a greater change in circulating leptin, you had a greater metabolic adaptation. And that's where this idea comes from of, well, maybe if you were to replace that leptin that was decreasing by quite a lot in some of these folks, maybe you could somehow minimize the metabolic adaptation and make the weight loss a little bit easier than it would be otherwise. So what I showed you was some experiments that we looked at in terms of modeling metabolic changes that take place when people are undergoing weight interventions in a research setting. And so we were interested in developing a tool for people to use, actually mostly for researchers to use initially, that would, if you plugged in baseline demographics and anthropometrics and made some prescriptions in terms of calorie intake and physical activity, could we predict the changes in energy expenditure, the calories that are burned, in other words, as well as the body weight and body composition, that fat mass change versus fat-free mass change. We simplified that really complicated model into a way that we could actually implement a model that would make these predictions as a little Java applet that we put on this website. This is what it looks like. It was written by an undergraduate math student, so it's not the most pretty looking thing in the world, but it's very functional. You basically enter in your initial weight, your gender, your age, your height. You answer a couple of questions about your physical activity at work and at leisure time, and that's going to estimate the baseline number of calories that you're eating just to maintain that particular weight. Then you can enter what your goal weight is and how long you want to take to achieve that weight. So for example, this person is starting off, you probably can't read it, at 110 kilos. They want to weigh 80 kilos in 6 months. And the model will predict what they have to do to their diet in order to both get to that goal, which is right here, as well as then maintain the goal once they get there, because that's a big problem, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So at the same time, when you're planning this weight change, you can say, okay, here's my goal. am I actually willing to do what it's going to take to get to the goal? And then maybe even more importantly, am I willing to do what it's going to take to permanently stay at that new goal weight? And the simulator can help you make those sorts of predictions. You can also change the physical activity. So here we have a little box that will open up, and you can add running or walking or cycling, and how many times a week and how much you want to do. And you can look at the trade-off between diet and exercise in terms of achieving a goal and then maintaining that goal weight. So this is our one answer to addressing the 3,500 calorie per pound rule that people had been using in the past. This will make more realistic predictions. It's now, we were kind of surprised at how popular this became. We've now had more than 1 million unique visitors on this website. We have about 500 people every day using this tool online, which is kind of surprising to me. But we have a big disclaimer at the front that says, don't use this for medical reasons, et cetera, but I don't know how effective that is. One person who had been using it was a weight loss doc in Cedar Rapids, Nate Brady. And he said, I've been using this tool now with some of my patients who, I've independently been documenting as very compliant to this very low calorie diet for varying durations of time. And he said, let me share some of my data with you. And what I'm plotting here is the data points from 2 of his very adherent clients, which he decided were adherent before he saw the simulation results. And you can see the curve, the solid curve here is the model's best estimate, and then given the uncertainty in some of these parameters, the dashed curves are the sort of uncertainty in the weight loss if these folks actually adhered to this diet. And you can see that the model does a reasonably good job of predicting in sort of real-world clinical setting of how much weight loss would be expected in these different people. In fact, when we looked at 60 of his subjects who he had previously deemed compliant to the program and compared the weight loss predicted by the model and the weight loss that was actually measured, you can see that there's a very high degree of correlation between the model predictions and the data that were observed. So we think that this isn't just a research tool in a research setting, but it can actually be applied to real life weight loss when people are adherent to the program. And that is the biggest trick, getting people to adhere to a program, because most people's weight loss looks something like this. That they lose weight for about 6 to 8 months, then they plateau, and then they start to regain the weight that they'd lost. This is data from Laura Svetke's group at Duke. This was actually a study designed to look at keeping weight off. So the intervention was designed to prevent that slow rise of weight that was seen. And we were really interested in what is the underlying changes of calorie intake that are responsible for this curve? Because I've told you a lot about the slowing of metabolism and how important that is and why it makes weight loss difficult. And in fact, that's what most people say is the reason for this curve. They say, okay, well, people go on a diet and they start losing weight, and that's great, and then eventually their metabolism slows down so that it matches what was in their diet. So they're back in balance again, and that's that plateau phase. And of course, they're still on this diet, but they're not getting any more bang for their buck anymore, and so they slowly fall off the wagon, and that's what's responsible for the weight regain. That's the sort of dogma of interpreting this typical weight loss curve. And we ask the question, well, what does the model say? Does the model actually make similar sorts of predictions? And we were initially surprised by the fact that no, that's not what the model says at all. What the model says is that what's happening underlying that curve is, yeah, you get that slowing of metabolism. That's the blue curve, right? That's the stuff that I was showing you before. But to get that initial rate of weight loss, they have to cut their calories a heck of a lot. Okay, so it's about an 800 calorie a day deficit initially. But that only stays around for 6 weeks, okay? And then they have this progressive loss of diet adherence. But the entire time that the black curve is below the blue curve, they're losing weight. So I don't know what that means psychologically to think about, okay, I keep cheating on my diet a little bit more and more every day, but I still keep losing weight, so this must be a miraculous diet. And by the time those two curves cross again, at about 8 months or so, you're almost all the way back up to where you started in terms of your behavior for energy intake. And by 10 months, you're all the way back up. And it's this very slow sort of time lag between what you do in terms of your behavior and how your body weight dynamics change. That's something that's predicted by the model. There's this very slow characteristic time scale that's responsible for that weight loss, plateau, and regain. So we don't know whether or not this is true or not. I have strong belief that this is probably what's happening, and we're starting a study hopefully in a few months that will start to address these questions in real people, but we'll see what happens. Just to kind of close, we actually have reevaluated the predictions of a 20% soda tax on adult prevalence of overweight and obesity. This was done in collaboration with those same economists at the USDA who are very open to collaboration, and we published this economics paper, my first economics paper in 2011, where we basically showed how wrong the 3,500 calorie per pound rule can be and how much of a more subtle but still perhaps important effect you could get by taxing sodas. And when a person from Coca-Cola saw me present this, they said, this is great. We've really got to get the word out there that, taxing our products isn't going to solve the obesity epidemic. And I said, yeah, well, that's one way to look at it. Maybe what this means is that we can't just tax your soda. We also have to limit your advertising to children and do all these other things. I don't think he liked that answer, but but maybe that's why I've never been invited to give a talk at Coke. So let me just stop by thanking a lot of the folks who were involved in these studies. The folks in blue are people who've been involved in either our clinical research or some of the mathematical modeling. I didn't talk at all about our clinical stuff today that have been in my lab. And I just really also want to thank the volunteer study subjects. I believe one is actually in the audience today, as well as the nursing staff at the metabolic unit at the NIH who've been everybody's been really helpful getting a physicist up to doing clinical research at the NIH. It's been a steep learning curve, but a lot of fun. So thanks.
Thank you very much.
I have two questions. The first is, I know a person a doctor that works in this field. He claims that if you go to artificial sweetener, low-calorie colas and so forth, he claims that the way your metabolism reacts to that, your liver and so forth, that it really doesn't you don't end up with that much fewer calories, net calorie intake, because your metabolism changes in response to the very sweet artificial sweeteners. Anything on that?
It's funny, a lot of people have really strong opinions about these things, right, with very little data to back them up. First of all, as I kind of showed you, if you cut calories out of your diet, regardless of how you do it, your metabolism will slow down and you won't get that same number of caloric benefit, right? So if you cut those, you switch to diet sodas from your regular Coke, and nothing else changes and you start to lose weight, your metabolism will slow down. Whether or not and that will have nothing to do with whether or not they're artificial sweeteners or anything else that's just the basic facts of cutting calories. So the short answer is yes, absolutely, that's right, that will happen, but not for the reasons probably that are being suggested. Although there's so little data on these things, the biggest problem in this field, in my opinion, is that you can't control what people eat when they're outside the laboratory, and you can't do experiments long enough in the laboratory to get a lot of meaningful data on these kinds of topics. So you're typically relegated to asking people what they eat or recording it in some way, and then there's lots of misreporting. So I think these are very difficult questions to answer on the long time periods that are characteristic with weight loss and obesity.
The other question I have is you show that the weight loss, and then as you go off the diet, you kind of gradually get back up. If you do that multiple times, you lose weight, and then gradually you get back up after a couple of years, and you say, okay, I'll go on a diet again, lose weight, go back up. That cycling up and down, is that bad for your health, or are you better off just, well, okay, I was underweight for half the time or a quarter of the time, so I've got that benefit?
So I'm aware of, I'm aware of some data where people have said, okay, well, if I've done these yo-yos, I end up at a higher weight than I was to begin with. But what they typically don't take into account is that most people are on a slowly increasing trajectory, and whether or not you've overshot that is still an open question. So I would tend to think that there's probably not a lot of data that suggests that temporary weight loss is bad for you. All of the positive biomarkers associated with weight loss and risk factors seem to change during those periods of time. So is it beneficial to have temporary improvement in those risk factors? I don't know the answer to that question. I wish I did, but I don't.
More experiments that are hard to conduct.
Yeah, exactly.
A related question, I guess. It seems like it's a no-brainer that, okay, it's good for your health to lose the fat. But is there actually the data? Is the person who was overweight and then lost his fat mass and became like normal or close to normal body mass index as healthy as the person who was there all the time? And related to it, like kind of there is saying that body tries to maintain the maximum weight that it ever achieved. Is there a physiological underpinning to that?
Yeah, Jack will probably have some other things to add, but a couple of things. One is that it's hard to do those studies long enough to keep people down at a lower weight long enough in order to address those questions. But one way that you can do it is with bariatric surgery. And the one thing that is pretty clear is that there is reduced mortality as a result of losing weight by bariatric surgery. Now, whether or not there's something special about bariatric surgery other than the fact that you can actually maintain that weight loss, I think is a question. There have been other analyses of that same data that suggested that it's really the folks who had type 2 diabetes before the surgery that drove most of the improved mortality estimates, but I don't think that there's really definitive answers to that. There's other really disturbing data that comes from Denmark that have suggested that losing weight by non-bariatric surgery means actually increases mortality. I think that that's pretty suspect, and if it's true, that's major news. I mean, and these are the sort of hard endpoints of mortality, not just improvement of risk factors. Everybody knows that you improve your risk factors when you lose weight. How that translates into these hard endpoints is, I think, still part of an open question. Jack, do you have something to add to that?
Great.
Okay.
Kevin, I noticed Nora Volkov, who's the director of the National Institute of Drug Addiction, is one of your collaborators.
Yes.
So that prompts the question of whether obesity and this compulsion to eat has the same imaging characteristics as, let's say, heroin addiction.
So the paper that I told you that I was writing on the way over here is going to address some of those things. But Nora helped us get set up in a study that's wrapping up now, looking at dopamine receptor availability measured by a PET, positron emission tomography, in a cross section of subjects, and we were interested in replicating her initial findings from back in 2001. Which showed that obese individuals had lower levels of dopamine receptor availability compared to lean individuals, and they were decreased to similar extent as people who are addicted to drugs of abuse. So we did that on a larger number of subjects, and we actually found the opposite result. And we looked at specific regions within the striatum, which is this region that is believed to be responsible for reward, motivation, motor control, as well as habit formation. And what we found was, interestingly, that when you looked at these substriatal regions, obesity or adiposity, either by BMI or actual fat mass measurements, was positively associated with regions of the striatum that are involved in habit formation. And we know that actually dopamine plays a role in accelerating the process of habit formation, and you can show this in animal models. And so, but what we did replicate with Nora's old data was that in this sort of reward region in the ventromedial striatum, what people often talk about as the nucleus accumbens region, that it was decreased in obese individuals, and correlated with, negatively correlated with BMI and adiposity. And that's where Nora's group had focused most of their attention on previously, was this reward and motivation region, suggesting that obesity is a state of hypofunctioning reward. And the idea was that maybe that leads people to eat more to get the same reward as they did before that process. So our data suggests that these dorsolateral striatal regions, these habit-forming regions, those regions that support habit formation, might be more important than the ventromedial striatal regions, but we don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting, and we're looking to see now how diet actually impacts dopamine binding in these regions. Because like I said, that black curve moving up, that's a food intake effect, right? We think we understand the blue curve well now, the slowing of metabolism, these metabolic adaptations, why people eat what they eat, and what influences in the environment influence which people to eat how much and what their food choices. That's the big mystery, in my opinion, and that's kind of where our research is starting to focus.
So is there a measurement of the resting energy metabolism with age? Because that is one thing, from my experience, I found out that my resting energy metabolism is decreasing as I am getting older.
Mm-hmm.
I guess this question, and then maybe I will ask another question, why the resting energy metabolism also decrease as you are cutting down your calorie intake?
Right. So with the aging process, I think, is really interesting. We haven't done a lot of modeling of aging yet, although we'd like to, and Tammy Harris from NIA is always encouraging me strongly to do that, and we'll move there now. We published a childhood model that's last year. Now we can move on to the aging problem. But one of the things that we know about aging, and Jack mentioned this, is that even if your weight is stable, you can be gaining fat and losing lean tissue. And even though there can be a disconnect between resting metabolic rate and lean tissue, like I showed you with these dramatic weight changes, lean tissue is still the primary driver of your resting metabolic rate. So even if your weight stays the same, and especially once you kind of pass into the sort of 70s or so, you can start to see this dissociation between body weight and body composition, so that you can maintain the same body weight or even lose weight and be losing quite a lot of lean tissue. And that will drive your metabolic rate lower.
How many free parameters do you have in your model?
So the question was, how many free parameters do you have in the model? So it's a good question. The most complicated model that I showed you, I had 5 free parameters. Okay, so everything else was determined by literature, and then I fit those 5 free parameters to a set of data that included, I believe, about more than 100 data points. So, and that was just the calibration phase. And then I went on to validate that model without changing any parameters in dozens of experiments. So this is the question of, give me enough free parameters I can fit an elephant, right? So you can just describe anything, or if you want to describe any sort of random series of data, you can fit a polynomial of, n dimensions into that thing, and you've described the data. The real trick of, once you've described the data, is can you predict new data? Can you predict the results of an experiment that's never been done before? As I showed you with the Biggest Loser experiment, we hadn't done that when we developed the model. Or data that weren't used to build the model, and we've done both of those things. So.
There are all these popular diets of eat this, don't eat that, avoid this, eat a lot of that. Do you have factors in that in your model?
Yeah, so the complicated model, the one with the 5 free parameters that I told you about, basically is at the level of dietary carbohydrate, fat, and protein. It doesn't distinguish between dietary carbohydrates other than in their digestibility. So if you have a lot of high fiber diet, not all of those calories are digestible. So that part is in there, but it doesn't, for example, say whether or not you have a lot of monounsaturated fatty acids versus, omega-3 fatty acids. It doesn't distinguish that level of detail. But we're really interested in this question of, I like to think of the human body as from an engineering analogy, right? You're basically a flex fuel automobile. You run on 3 different kinds of fuels. You can basically put in your gas tank whatever's the cheapest on that particular day. You're going to run relatively well, but actually you don't even have a gas tank. Your car is built out of the fuel, and it's constantly turning over its parts. And so how is it that this machine can adapt so well to dramatic swings in the composition of the fuels that are coming in? And that was really the basis for building that very complicated model, was to understand the physiology and the fact that so many good experiments looking at different kinds of diets and their impact on physiology had been done before allowed us to build that model. The efficacy of all of these kinds of diets, I think, boils down to whether or not you stick to them, and also possibly whether there's some metabolic advantage to one diet over another. I happen to believe that the biggest impact is whether or not you're sticking to your diet. But we're designing studies and doing studies as we speak where we keep people, and one of them is in the audience right now, staying at the NIH Clinical Center for 2 months continuously, and we very carefully feed them a diet where they have to eat everything that's there. And we are going to dramatically change the macronutrient composition of the diet and see if there is metabolic changes that take place as a result of that. So we're really interested in those questions, but we don't have an answer for you.
I noticed there's been very little talk of brown fat, for example, cold and isorin, if that's still a subject. And the other part is, what about this story about the bacterial flora of lean people versus fat people?
Mm-hmm. So 2 excellent questions and very hot topics in obesity research, no pun intended. With respect to brown adipose tissue, I think, and Jack's group has done some work on this, obese people tend to have lower amount of brown adipose tissue. Whether or not it's because they don't need it because fat is a really good insulator, or if that was causative, we don't know the answer to that question yet. We also don't really know how much energy expenditure is expected to change by activating that brown adipose tissue. We can simulate lots of things. One of the things, and there's a very nice paper that recently came out looking at cold exposure in humans to look to see how much energy expenditure goes up. A lot of the previous studies that have looked at that and have also allowed people to eat whatever they want have found that the cold exposure, yes, causes a slight increase in metabolic rate, of which they ate more than that went up. So Kong Chen is doing a really nice study right now looking at cold exposure at various different temperatures and trying to draw the curve of metabolic rate as a function of ambient temperature and measured in our metabolic chambers at the 7th floor of the clinical center. So I think that lots of interesting work needs to be done in that area. And as of yet, we have not modeled activation or inactivation of brown adipose tissue as part of our model. You also allude to a lot of the interesting work on gut microbiome and microflora that have been shown to change when you change your diet and have been shown to be different in obese individuals versus lean individuals. A lot of the mechanisms by which that has been purported to take place have been involving altered, basically absorbability of food, mostly in rodent models where it's actually very difficult to do those measurements carefully, as my former postdoc who measured daily food intake corrected for spillage over many, many, many weeks knows. So it's actually hard to interpret those studies, in my opinion. And another interesting question is how much energy does this microbiome require? It's another organ in some sense that requires energy. And are they really living just off the stuff that we wouldn't normally digest anyway? I think those are interesting questions. One thing I think is true is that the amount of bacteria in your gut that's often talked about, of like half a kilogram or a kilogram, I think those are dramatic overestimates. It's probably less than 50 grams or so when you do the math correctly. So that kind of limits the amount of energy expenditure that organ can possibly generate. But I think they're interesting questions. Did you have anything?
I want to bring Dr. Yanovski on the stage again. So
Good.
a question to you and give you a little breather. We have basically two ways of induced calorie restriction in a mouse model. And one is to give them a restricted diet with some low calorie content and so on. But the other one is basically take away their food every other day. And the results are, at the end of the day, are very similar. Can you comment on that and perhaps some extrapolation to human studies?
Well, so this is a very interesting area about alternate day fasting, I think is what you're suggesting. That there's some now developing human data that it may not be, at least in the short term, metabolically detrimental. And whether it's, I mean, I have to say for myself personally, I would rather, reduce some every day than have 24-hour fasts intermittently. But that doesn't mean that it's not a successful strategy. I mean, as Dr. Hall alluded to, the fact that diets of any sort work when you adhere to them, and if it's easier to be completely adherent to a 24-hour fast with food intake in between, that's great. That's reduced overall energy intake. That's fabulous. I think it is interesting to speculate that there could be metabolic adaptations with that kind of approach that would lead to incomplete compensation for the energy you didn't take in on the fasting day, or changes in metabolic parameters that would, in fact, lead to less active utilization or storage of the calories on the day when food is taken in. I think that we don't have enough information about it in humans, certainly, but maybe Kevin is going to collect those data next year.
Basically in a mouse.
Well, listen, I want to thank both of you for